Welcome to the Stop and Think series. I'm Will Markham. It's a series dedicated to training not on what to think, but how to think so that you can dissect all the BS on your own. And lesson number 3 is a unique one. It's 7 ways to unsheep yourself, or 7 ways to make ourselves more immune from being manipulated and deceived. So let's go ahead and begin with number 1. We must want to think for ourselves. You see, the sheep is perfectly capable of thinking for itself, but it wants someone else to think for them. Now, when you think on this deeply, this is one of the character traits that separated the Hillary fans from the Bernie fans in 2016, because they wanted CNN to think for them. They wanted the New York Times to think for them. They wanted MSNBC to think for them. And it was this reliance that prevented them from witnessing the media blackouts, the corruptions, the gaslighting tactics, the election fraud, because to them, these corporate networks determined the truth from the lies, the real events from the fake. To them, these corporate networks were the source of all truth. And it was this desire to have others think for them that herded them like sheep. So it's not enough for you to think for yourself. You have to want to think for yourself. Number 2, we have to love reality more than our fantasies. Now, at first you might think, wait, what does this have to do with unsheeping? Well, let me go ahead and give you an example here.
This con man, Henry Oberlander, he was such an effective con man, British authorities say he could have undermined the entire banking system of the Western world. And you can't find this guy on Google. You can't find him anywhere. He was interviewed once, and he said the following. He said, look, I've got one rule. And this was Henry's rule. He said, look, everyone is willing to give you something. They're ready to give you something for whatever it is they're hungry for. And that's the crux of it. If you don't want to be deceived, you have to know, what is it that you're hungry for? And we all kind of hate to admit it. You know, we kind of wish we were better husbands, better wives, smarter, more powerful, taller, richer, the list goes on. Lying is an attempt to bridge that gap, to connect our wishes and our fantasies about who we wish we were, how we wish we could be, with what we're really like.
What is it that we are hungry for? Because the sooner that we can recognize this and change ourselves to love what is real instead of what we wish for, we will become immune to con artistry and much less susceptible to lies. Number 3, never give in to fear, ever. Now let's go back to the sheep example. The sheep thinks it's awake. And the reason the sheep thinks it's awake is because the sheep is freaked out. But because the sheep is operating by fear, it reacts by fear, and therefore it is herded by fear. You see, people are so easily manipulated when they're afraid. And propagandists use the fear button all the time. So the trick is to never let fear control our thinking patterns. If we're freaking out, we are being sheep. Number 4, control our emotional attachments and triggers. Now, we as humans like to form emotional bonds to various principles or policies, and by and large, this is a very good thing that we form these attachments. But what if I told you these attachments also make us vulnerable to manipulation? Because these attachments will also cause us to be triggered on occasion. And what the expert manipulators will do, and they do this all the time, is they will exploit our emotional attachments to a particular topic as a means to distract us from a more heinous crime being committed behind our backs. So how do we prevent this exploitation from happening? Well, a couple ways. Number 1, by reconciling our emotional attachments with the reality in front of us. Or number 2, just by keeping our triggers in check. For example,
then he was caught on camera saying that he takes what he wants from women and he dropped the P word in the process. You cannot be the president and use the P word.
How many times have you seen people totally freak out over Trump's using the P word, but not freak out over Hillary's regime change in Honduras, Libya, Haiti, or Syria? Now let's stop and think for a moment. How many people were actually harmed by Trump's saying the P word? Now compare that to how many people were actually harmed by regime change in Honduras, Libya, Haiti, or Syria. Now, for those of you who don't know the numbers regarding the regime change, it's over 10 million. Or to put things into perspective, if I had $1 for every child that Hillary bombed, dismembered, or starved, holy shit! Now, make no mistake, both of these things are bad and quite outrageous, but size matters. So remember, our emotional attachments are not bad, we just need to control them before they control us. Number 5, reduce our bias. Everyone is biased, and that's quite okay. What's not okay is when our bias is so bad that we stop listening or stop considering other viewpoints. And so, always listen, always consider, and remember this quote: you can learn more from your enemies than from your friends. Number 6, audit our ideology. This is when you take that long look in the mirror and ask ourselves the hard questions, except we're asking our ideology the hard questions. Now, there's a million ways you can do this on your own, but I'll give you a quick sample audit list. First off, does my ideology demonize humans? This would include having a us versus them mentality for humans. Another one is, am I defending bad behavior? Because we should let bad behavior stay bad and instead admit and confess the imperfections and take ownership of both the good and the bad, because pretending to be perfect is kind of absurd. Okay, and another question here. Am I making exceptions for myself, or am I making exceptions for my ideology? One of the big rules to intellectual integrity is to never make exceptions for yourself. And the last question, and one of the most important to ask yourself or your ideology, is, why am I trying to rationalize? Because more often than not, the act of rationalizing is taking something that you know to be wrong and trying to somehow convince yourself that it's right. It's intentionally warping your moral compass, more or less. Now, why is auditing our ideology so important? Because if we don't keep our ideology in check, it's only a matter of time until our ideology transforms into exactly what we hate. And I'll give you an example right here.
I'm pissed off, Tim. What's happened to the left? What's happened to us? I thought after Trump we'd finally start getting it, but we're getting worse. Isn't it obvious that we need to change our tactics? And yet we're making exactly the same mistakes, only worse. When you go to a university campus and set fire to things, throw rocks at police, pepper spray and punch people whose opinions you don't like, you're not a liberal, you're not left-wing, you're a fucking idiot. And you lose the argument. It's a gift to Trump. How fucking thick do you have to be to hand Trump the moral high ground? With everything he and his ultra-conservative posse are up to hand them the moral high ground, it's unforgivable. And by stopping a few hundred people hearing some objectionable right-wing provocateur speak, his book just hit the top of the charts. Well done, you lost. And when Trump rightly condemns this violence and calls out Berkeley Uni for suppressing freedom of speech, he's not wrong. They just put Trump in the right. You handed it to him. How dare these people put me in a position where I'm agreeing with that orange sack of minge? All the chaos that Trump is creating, utter chaos. And these twats who think they represent the left, they just handed it to him. It's not just a handful of violent thugs, Tim, when they're being legitimized by thousands of people proudly retweeting videos of Trump supporters getting punched or pepper sprayed. You're handing the moral high ground to Trump, and it fucking boils my piss. You got The Guardian running articles asking whether it's ethical to punch a Nazi. What the fuck are you talking about? Weighing up the pros and cons of arbitrarily labeling someone a Nazi in order to legitimize punching them in the face. What the fuck does The Guardian think it's doing? But if I were to express these views publicly, I'm the one that gets branded as a Nazi apologist. It's fucked up. The free speech movement started in Berkeley. Now they're tearing it apart. The irony of it. These people honestly believe they're fighting fascism. Shutting people's opinions down through violence isn't fighting fascism, it is fascism.
And number 7, detach our ego from our ideology. Have you ever witnessed a scenario where someone talks bad about another person's religion or ideology, and the other person takes it personally and just loses it? Well, when a person reacts as if the attack on their ideology is a personal attack on them, it reveals that the person's ego is attached to their ideology, and this is why they feel personally attacked. Now, there's nothing wrong with having an ego, and there's nothing wrong with having an ideology, but having the two attached is unhealthy. And having the two attached will greatly increase your bias as well as your emotional triggers. In other words, it makes you extremely vulnerable to being manipulated. And so, these are the 7 ways that you can unsheep yourself. And please comment with your thoughts and insights. And remember, don't be a sheep, be a goat. Because goats are always on top of things.